Hello viewers and welcome back to Dukascopy TV. I'm Natalie MacDonald. Joining me in the studio now is Erwan Berthelot of White & Case to discuss trade legislation. And thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, the first item, in fact, which we are going to discuss is the WTO Bali Ministerial Conference, and that's an item which is taking place this week. For those not familiar with this conference, can you walk us through it a little bit?
Sure. Well, the primary aim of the Bali Ministerial Conference is going to be try and finally broker a deal after 12 intensive years of negotiation. As you know, the Doha Development Round was launched in 2001, and since then WTO members have struggled with reaching an agreement on anything. Bali is largely viewed as the last chance to reach such an agreement before WTO members start to significantly turn their back to the World Trade Organization and perceive it as failing to deliver its objective of brokering trade deals.
Now, should the conference fail, which unfortunately it is largely expected to, what could the fallout be? What knock-on impact could this have on business?
Well, the main impact will be sending out another very negative signal to the world and trade community that the WTO is no longer performing its function as a negotiating body. And in order to secure to the best extent the success of the Bali Ministerial, the ambition of the negotiation has been revised significantly downwards. There are currently only 3 items on the negotiating table, that is agriculture, development issues, including some flexibilities for these developed countries, and also very important for business operators, a package on trade facilitation. Now, even with this reduced negotiating scope, it is highly uncertain at this stage whether the Bali Ministerial will be able to provide a framework for an agreement and if there will be a deal at the end of this week. WTO members have been struggling hard, especially since the appointment of the new Director General of the WTO, Roberto Azevedo, in September this year. There have been a lot of last-minute intensive efforts here in Geneva to reach a compromise, but last week the Director General called a halt on the Geneva negotiating process and informed membership that a final text was not yet ready for trade ministers to approve. This doesn't mean that an agreement cannot be reached, because in the back scene there will be intensive further negotiation, and there has been a lot of political will and political push over the past days. But even with his best efforts, we still don't know what will come out of Bali this week.
Okay then, now something else I wanted to ask you about is there's been a lot of discourse of late regarding bilateral trade partnerships. Do you note a trend forming here, and do these types of partnerships provide some sort of balance, for example?
Well, yes, indeed. There is definitely a trend, and this trend has to do with the failure so far of the WTO to deliver a multilateral trade deal. So what happens is that WTO members, especially the large prominent members such as the European Union or the United States, start to negotiate in the view to obtaining the benefits they cannot obtain through the WTO with selected trade partners, either bilaterally or at a regional level. And there are currently 2 prominent examples of such deals being negotiated. That is, on the one hand, the Trans-Pacific Partnership between the United States and 11 countries of the Pacific region, and the so-called Trade and Investment Partnership between the European Union and the United States. These 2 deals only could cover up to 60% of the world GDP. So there are massive interests at stake, and if the WTO cannot fulfill its purpose, it is clear that these trading partners will continue this trend towards bilateral and regional negotiation.
You mentioned there the US and the 11 Pacific trade countries, and news emerged recently that WikiLeaks had in fact leaked a serious chapter from these secret international trade negotiations. In your experience, what could this do to the negotiations?
Well, first of all, I think it's fair to say that leaking of information, even sensitive information, is nothing new in the context of trade or international negotiations. I think this happens every time. The question of the consequences, however, is relevant because it has a lot to do with the sensitivity of the information at stake. Personally, I don't think that what has been leaked on WikiLeaks, which is the intellectual property chapter of the contemplated Trans-Pacific deal, would be sufficient to entirely derail the negotiating process, because there is much more at stake than this chapter only. But it is true, and we've seen it, for instance, last year in the European Union with the failure of the anti-counterfeiting trade agreement, that if civil society, media, public opinion in general picks up these issues, which can be sensitive, then there is a risk that intensive public opinion pressure could lead to the withdrawal of political support. And that is the major risk. In the case of the TPP, again, I don't think this would be enough to derail the deal entirely, but it could lead to delays or additional complexities in reaching a final agreement.
Lastly then, something which has been born out of a lot of the themes that we've discussed today is a shift towards investment-led trade agreements, really. What's your stance on this shift?
Right. Here again, I think there is a clear trend, and I think that the European Union in particular is having a leading role in integrating investment chapters in the trade agreements it currently negotiates. There are technical reasons for this, largely due to the extension of the European Union competences to investment protection via the Lisbon Treaty. And as a matter of fact, the European Union has now announced that it's going to make investment and investment protection an integral part of all the future trade deals it will negotiate. It has already started to do so. Recently, there has been a trade deal between the EU and Canada, inked, which includes an investment protection chapter with an investor-to-state dispute settlement mechanism. This is also being negotiated in the context of the Transatlantic Partnership Agreement. And the EU is also at the moment initiating separate negotiations with China and the ASEAN on investment. All this will deliver benefits to business operators, because it will add to the predictability, the transparency of the system, and it will provide more opportunities to challenge measures by states which are parties to such agreement, and eventually to obtain compensation when the benefits of investment are being jeopardized, for instance, by way of regulatory intervention.
And thank you so much for coming in today and taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you very much again for inviting me.
Thank you. I'll be back shortly with more exclusive interviews for you, so don't go away. Goodbye for now.